Okay, so you're all preparing for the FAA Part 107 exam for 2026 and 2027. Pay close attention to this video because the FAA has now changed the way that they're testing you. You see, it's no longer just simple questions now. They're going to be giving you scenarios, and they're now trying to see how they can test you so that way they can determine how you think. So the questions that I'm going to be giving you today are going to be scenario-based questions, not simple questions. They're going to be questions where you have to actually think about the answer. Basically, what I'm going to be doing is reading the questions to you, giving you the answers, and then giving you a detailed explanation of those answers so you can take your notes appropriately. Now, this is going to be something that's very advantageous to you because these questions are very tricky, and the FAA loves to do that with you. They reword things and they put certain elements into the questions where it will confuse you. But we're going to circumvent those issues by understanding exactly what the FAA is trying to do when they want to prove that you know how to answer those questions appropriately. Let's start with question number 1 first, and this has to do with aircraft right-of-way. Here's the question. You're flying your drone near an airport, and you notice a manned aircraft approaching your area at a lower altitude than expected. What should you do? Do you see how the FAA is giving you these questions so you need to think about the answer? You're so confused right now about this question that they just gave you that you don't even really want to look at the answers yet, do you? But here are the 3 multiple choice answers. A, maintain altitude and continue your mission. B, descend immediately and yield to the right of way. Or C, increase altitude to avoid the conflict. Now, the correct answer here is going to be B, descend immediately and yield to the right of way. You see, what the FAA is looking for in regard to this explanation I'm going to give you is that they're looking for an immediate action. They're not looking for you to hover and stay there and just sort of observe. They want you to take immediate action. And immediate action is in the question and in the answer. Because if you look at B, as I'm displaying on screen, it says descend immediately. When you see that word immediately, that means that is a visual clue that the FAA wants to know if you're thinking about an immediate action. So you see how I'm giving you these scenario questions. That was question number 1. Let me go ahead and explain question number 1 to you so you understand it. You see, a manned aircraft always has the right of way. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. If it's a manned aircraft, it always has the right of way. Remember that. Write that down in your notes. Under FAA Part 107, you must yield right of way regardless of altitude. It doesn't matter if the aircraft is at a lower altitude or higher altitude. It makes no difference. Now, let's move to question number 2, and this has to do with handing over the controls to another remote pilot. You're flying a mission and you need to hand over the controls to another certified remote pilot. What must occur? Multiple choice answers. A, nothing. Control can be transferred freely. B, a clear transfer of control must be established. C, the drone must land first. The answer here is B. A clear transfer of control must be established. Let me give you the detailed explanation. You see, the FAA requires a positive transfer of control or a positive exchange of control. What this means is that both pilots clearly acknowledge who is flying the drone. Both pilots understand who is the responsible remote pilot. This prevents any confusion of accidents, and B is the correct answer. Now let's move to question number 3 that has to do with ADS-B out. And quite honestly, I had no clue that they were putting this on the exam. Tricky FAA. You see, ADS-B out is not something that drones utilize. We use remote ID. ADS-B out is for aircrafts and planes. It's not for drones. But they put this question on the exam anyway. Here's the question. You're flying near an aircraft broadcasting ADS-B out signals. What is required of your drone? What kind of trick question is that? Can you believe it? So here are the answers. A, your drone must also broadcast ADS-B out. B, you must avoid interference with ADS-B signals. Or C, you must land immediately. Now, honestly, would you know that answer? The correct answer for this will be B. you must avoid ADS-B interference, or you must avoid interfering with ADS-B signals. So the explanation, so you fully understand this, is that drones generally are prohibited from broadcasting ADS-B out because it causes clutter and static. So the explanation to this answer is that drones are generally prohibited from broadcasting ADS-B out because it interferes or clutters with ATC systems. You must not interfere with manned aircraft broadcast systems. So ADS-B out is not something that you can use on a drone. Okay, let's move to question number 4, which has to do with Smokestack Plume. Here's the question. While conducting a drone inspection near an industrial facility, you observe a smokestack plume that is rapidly rising, breaking apart, and swirling in multiple directions shortly after exiting the stack. What type of condition is most likely present? Here are the answer choices. A. Stable air with calm wind conditions. B. Unstable air with possible turbulence. Or C, no wind condition or smooth flow. The correct answer here will be B, unstable air with possible turbulence. Now, the key things or the key words that you need to pay attention to in the question will be rapidly rising, breaking apart, swirling in multiple directions. The smoke drifting and sporadically moving up and down like it's crazy tells you that the air is unstable, and this is what the FAA is looking for. It's a tricky question. They want you to understand that when you're flying around a smokestack plume, that the air can affect the movement and control of your drone, so that way you understand how to avoid any issues when you're flying. Okay, question number 5 has to do with unmanned hot air balloons. Notice how I said unmanned hot air balloons. Not all hot air balloons are manned. They have some hot air balloons that are unmanned, like those experimental balloons you see that NASA puts up to check the atmosphere conditions and all of that stuff. You know, they have no people in those balloons. They're unmanned. But what they do have are cords and cables and stuff hanging from the bottom, and meters and transponders and a whole bunch of stuff hanging from the bottom of that thing. And that's what you have to understand, that there's a difference between a manned hot air balloon and an unmanned hot air balloon, which is purely experimental. So here's the question. You encounter an unmanned hot air balloon during flight. What should you do? Whoever thought of that question needs to be hung up by their toenails. But anyway, A, maintain course. B, yield the right of way. C, fly above the hot air balloon. Now, a lot of you would think that, it's unmanned. Let me just fly above it and, I won't have a problem, or I'll just maintain course because I'm not going to run into it. But the correct answer here is B. Any aircraft, manned or unmanned, the remote pilot in command and that drone must yield the right of way. Yielding the right of way is something that's a common term with the FAA, and you're going to have to get used to it. Yielding the right of way, answer B, is the correct answer. So let me give you the explanation. A lot of these unmanned hot air balloons have cables hanging at the bottom of them, and the FAA knows that they're not very visible. It's not easy for a remote pilot to be able to see those cables, so they say that you must stay clear and yield the right of way to those unmanned hot air balloons. Regardless of whether it's manned or not, you need to yield the right of way is the correct answer. Okay, moving to question number 6, which has to do with remote ID failure. Here's the question. In mid-flight, your remote ID systems fail. What should you do? A, continue with the flight if safe. B, land as soon as practicably possible. Or C, turn off your drone. Now, we all know that C is a ridiculous answer because there's no way you're going to turn off your drone in mid-flight, right? So we rule C out. So we're only dealing with A and B here. Now, the correct answer, as you already know, is B, land the drone as soon as practicably possible. Now, the explanation for this is that remote ID is always required under Part 89, and if it fails, you must land the drone as soon as possible. That's basically what the rule says under Part 89. So you already know the answer to that one. Let's move to question number 7, which has to do with anti-collision lights when you're flying at night. Here is the question. You're flying at night and your anti-collision lights appear to be too bright. What can you do? Now, this would be a very tricky question if you haven't already read this and understood it before. Answer choices. A, turn them off. B, dim them if possible. Or C, ignore the issue. Well, you already know that answer A is pretty much ridiculous because you're not going to be able to turn off your anti-collision lights at night because they're required that you have anti-collision lights when you're flying at night. So answer A, you can just rule it out. Answer C is also a ridiculous answer because there's absolutely nothing that you're going to be ignoring when it comes to flying a drone, believe me. So the correct answer here is B, dim them when possible. Now, the full explanation of this is that the FAA allows you to dim those anti-collision lights if it has to do with safety. Safety is the main word here. As you already know, that you must maintain 3 statute miles of visibility when it's about anti-collision lights. But the key thing that you're looking for here is that you are able to dim anti-collision lights if it has to do with safety of the operation of flying your drone at night. Okay, let's move to number 8, and this is about using a visual observer at night. Here's the question. You're conducting a night flight with a visual observer, VO. Which of the following is required for a safe operation? Here are the answers. A, the VO may maintain visual line of sight with the drone using binoculars. B, the VO may monitor the drone only on screen if they cannot see it directly. Or C, the VO must maintain unaided visual line of sight with the drone at all times. Now, all of you are probably thinking that there is some difference between a visual observer during the day and a visual observer during night. But the fact of the matter is that there is no difference. When you have a visual observer, that visual line of sight, VLOS, must be maintained at all times. It does not matter. So the correct answer is C. Here's the explanation. Part 107 requires that the visual observer must maintain visual line of sight, VLOS, at all times with unaided vision, even at night. Binoculars or monitors do not meet this requirement. So the correct answer here is C. Now, moving to number 9, sectional chart symbols. Now, this is something that a lot of you struggle with, and for good reason, because sectional chart symbols are very confusing sometimes, and there are just so many of them. But here's the question. While planning a flight near a small municipal airport, you noticed a dashed magenta circle on a sectional chart surrounding the airport. What does this indicate? Well, it's going to be either Class B airspace, or it's going to be Class D airspace, or it's going to be Class E airspace at the surface. A lot of you have been on my website and you already know this answer. Class E airspace that begins at the surface will always be a dashed magenta line around an airport because it begins at the surface and you must have ATC authorization when you are flying Class E airspace that begins at the surface. Now let's talk about question number 10, and this has to do with motion parallax. And just to be transparent with you, when I took the Part 107 exam, I had absolutely no clue what motion parallax even meant. There was nothing on the study guides that I had that even talked about motion parallax. But anyway, let's ask the question here and we'll go through the answers and explanation. During an inspection flight, you notice that objects that are closer to the drone appear to be moving across your visual field faster than distant objects that are not moving as fast. What is the phenomenon that you are observing? This will throw you for a loop because if you did not study this or know this, then you're going to get the question wrong. Here are the answers to that question. A, optical illusion unrelated to depth perception. B, motion parallax, which helps judge relative distance. Or C, standard depth perception that is unaffected by movement. Now, there is absolutely no way you're going to get that answer correct if you didn't know what the correct answer was. So the correct answer is B. You see, motion parallax is a visual clue that's used to judge distances based on relative movement. It's a very important safe navigational tool that's used, especially when you're talking about near objects and far objects. So motion parallax is something that you will need to know. Go to my website, you'll read about it, and you'll need to know what this is in order to get this question correct on the Part 107 exam. Okay, number 11 has to do with fatigue. And here's the question. After pulling an all-nighter to prepare for a flight, you feel extreme tiredness and your reaction time is slowed. What type of fatigue is this? Well, the answers are A, chronic fatigue, B, acute fatigue, C, stress. Now, before I give you this answer, do you honestly know what the correct answer is? Half of you are saying yes, half of you are saying no, because if you didn't study this, then you'd just be guessing. And you don't want to guess on the Part 107 exam. You want to know the answer before you actually answer the questions. So here it is. The answer, correct answer, is B, acute fatigue. Now, the explanation for this is that fatigue is a short-term tiredness. It's due to things such as lack of sleep, or when you did something with intense effort and you have this temporary tiredness that doesn't last very long. The significance of this is that it reduces the cognitive performance that you need to have whenever it is that you're flying a drone, and it should be addressed before flight. So acute fatigue is whenever you have this tiredness short term and you have to, let's say, put your drone up in the air and you don't really feel as though you have the energy to be able to do what you need to do, but it's only temporarily short term. Now let's move to question 12, which is somewhat related, and this has to do with chronic stress. Now, by saying chronic stress, I just gave you the answer to the question, but I did that on purpose because I want you to understand the significance, the difference between chronic and acute. Now, anytime you hear the word chronic, we're not talking about Dr. Dre's album. We're talking about something such as arthritis or chronic arthritis, chronic diabetes. These things last for months, 3 months, 6 months, and they last long term. So anytime you hear the word chronic, you're thinking about something long term. And I bet you'll never forget what I just said. Because when you remember the word chronic has to do with long term, then you also understand how to answer the question correctly. So here's the question. You have been under persistent work-related stress for several months, which is starting to affect your focus during drone operations. What type of stress is this? Now, do I need to tell you the answer? Because I already gave it to you. The correct answer is B, chronic stress. You see the answers here, A being acute stress, B being chronic stress, C being temporary fatigue. Well, before you even looked at the answers, such as I just did, you would already know what that answer is in your head already. So looking at the answers after you've read the question is just mere confirmation of what it is that you already know in your head. So the explanation for this is that chronic stress is a long-term condition and it negatively affects your performance and decision-making. Part 107 pilots must manage this to maintain safe operation. Let's move to question number 13, which is about flying over people accidentally. Now, here's the question. During a survey flight, you realize that your drone is flying over a crowd of people or bystanders for a few seconds. What is your immediate responsibility? You see how the FAA is focusing these questions on remote pilot concerns, and they're putting it in the form of a scenario. They're basing the questions in the form of a story or a scenario. And this is for a purpose because they want you to understand that when you are in this particular situation, that you know how to respond or how to think correctly in regard to the situation that you're currently in. So in regard to this particular question, here are the answers. A, continue with the flight briefly since the exposure is minimal. B, move the drone immediately to a safe location away from the crowd. Or C, slowly descend over the crowd. Now, come on, you know that the last one I just read, C, is completely and utterly ridiculous because when they're asking you not to fly over people, and the question here says that, that you have a responsibility and what is your immediate action, then it's not going to be slowly descend if you see the word, what is your immediate action? So that in itself tells you that that's not an applicable answer. So the correct answer here is B, move the drone immediately to a safe location away from the crowd. The explanation for this is that under Part 107.39, it prohibits the operation of flying over people unless waivers are granted. An immediate correction of this action is required to prevent endangering the crowd or the other people or whoever's below. You cannot fly over people, and that is something something that is very important for the FAA. They want you to understand that you cannot fly a drone over people. If you are flying over people, there needs to be an immediate action. Now, number 14 is about remote ID broadcast. Here's the question. You are using a drone that does not have built-in remote ID capabilities. What must you do to comply with regulations? Well, if you don't have a drone that has remote ID built in, then the obvious and logical thing is to understand that you have to have something that's external that broadcasts remote ID. Here are the answer choices. A, nothing. Built-in remote ID is optional. B, attach an FAA compliant broadcast module before flight. And C, file for a waiver each time you fly. Now, the correct answer obviously is B, but here's the explanation. When a drone does not have standard remote ID built in, you will need to attach an external remote ID module. That's going to allow you to remain compliant with what's under Part 89 of the Code of Federal Regulations. Moving to question number 15, which is a tricky FAA question in regard to visual line of sight. Here's the question. You are monitoring your drone exclusively through the onboard camera feed, the display screen. Is this compliant with Part 107? Well, a lot of you might say, yeah, it's compliant because you're viewing your drone, or you can see where you're going through the display screen. But here's the thing. When you are flying a drone, you must always maintain visual line of sight with your own two eyes. You cannot be looking through a monitor or the screen or goggles and then thinking that that's going to replace visual line of sight. It's not going to happen. So here are the answer choices. Yes, the screen can replace direct visual line of sight. B, no, visual line of sight must be maintained unaided. Or C, yes, if the VO is present. The explanation for this is that the FAA wants you to understand that visual line of sight must be unaided, and video screens or FPV drone goggles are not part of this requirement. So through a visual observer, even if the visual observer is looking at a display screen, it does not matter. Visual line of sight must be maintained in order to remain compliant. Okay, so question 16 is something that a lot of you struggle with, and that has to do with cloud clearance. Let me read the question to you, but listen carefully as I'm reading the question and understand everything in the question before you actually think about the answer. Here's the question. You're flying a drone near an industrial site when clouds begin forming nearby. You are currently at 350 feet AGL. The clouds appear to be at 500 feet AGL. Visibility is good. What must you do to comply with Part 107 rules and regulations? Now, a lot of you are thinking, okay, so I'm 350 feet. That's good. I'm below the clouds. The clouds are at 500 feet AGL. That's good. Well, I'm complying. I'm not getting anywhere near the clouds, and I'm doing what I need to do. Visibility is good. No. Understand this Part 107 rule. The requirement says that you must maintain a distance, a vertical distance of 500 feet below the clouds. So if the clouds are 500 feet and you must be 500 feet below, then 500 minus 500 equals 0. That means that you're on the ground. That means that you can't fly. You have no legal altitude that you can fly that drone because the clouds are at 500 feet, and Part 107 says that you must be at least 500 feet below the clouds vertically and 2,000 feet away from the clouds horizontally. So I'm going to read the answers now to you and choose the appropriate answer. A, continue your flight or maintain altitude since you're below the clouds. B, maintain at least 500 feet below the clouds even if it requires descending. Or C, maintain 500 feet horizontally from the clouds but no vertical requirement. Now, you can already see that C is a ridiculous answer because it says maintain 500 feet away from the clouds when you already know that you have to be 2,000 feet horizontally away from the clouds. The correct answer is B, but it should say that you are not legally allowed to fly because you must maintain a vertical limit of 500 feet below clouds, and that means that would put you on the ground if the clouds are at 500 feet AGL. Okay, FAA tricky question coming up for number 17 has to do with the maximum altitude near a structure. Let's talk about this. Here's the question. You are conducting an inspection of a communication tower that rises 550 feet AGL. During the operation, you position your drone directly next to the structure and climb to 750 feet AGL in order to capture detailed imagery from above. You maintain a distance horizontally of 200 feet away from the tower at all times. Is this operation compliant with Part 107? Here's an FAA trick question for you. Remember, you are now at 750 feet AGL. You're not at 400 feet AGL. You're at 750 feet AGL. Is this compliant? You see, a lot of you are going to get so confused because the only thing you're thinking about is, no, I've got to stay 400 feet above the ground and that's legal. No, understand that when you are within 400 feet of any structure, that you can fly 400 feet above that structure regardless of whatever that height of that structure is. So the tower is 550 feet. Technically, you would be able to fly up to 950 feet if you're within 400 feet of that tower. So I'm only at 750 feet, and that puts me in legal limit, legal altitude of flying that drone. But a lot of you are going to be confused and get tricked into thinking that the answer that says 400 feet AGL is the correct answer. That's why I'm giving you this question. So here are the answers now that I've given you the answer. A, no, because the drone may never exceed 450 feet AGL. That was the trick one. B, yes, because you are within 400 feet of the structure and below the maximum allowable altitude. That's the correct answer, B. And C, no, because you must stay below the height of the structure. Do you see how the FAA does this? They want to make sure that you know that you can fly 400 feet above any structure as long as you are within 400 feet distance of that structure. Question number 18, which seems to be a simple question, but a lot of you will still get this question wrong. It is about flying in Class G airspace, Class G Gulf airspace. You're planning a flight in a rural area, rural meaning that there's less people. There's not a lot of people there. You're planning a flight in a rural area with no nearby airport. The sectional chart shows Class G airspace at the surface. What must you do before flying? A, request ATC authorization. You don't need ATC authorization because it's Class G airspace, so that's not going to be the correct answer. B, nothing. Authorization is not required. That seems to be the correct answer, don't you think? And C, file a flight plan. Now, you would not believe how many people will answer C, file a flight plan, as the correct answer. And it's simply because the FAA is giving you an answer that you think you must comply with. There is no flight plan necessary when you're flying in Class G airspace. There's no authorization. There's nothing that's required. When you're in Class G airspace, you can fly and do whatever it is that you like and your heart desires, as long as you stay 400 feet or below, according to the FAA rules and regulations. Let's move to question number 19, which has to do with flying in Class E airspace. And a lot of you just perked up because you know Class E airspace is tricky in itself, but the FAA is going to take advantage of Class E airspace because they know that it's tricky. So here's the question. You want to fly a drone near a regional airport where the sectional chart shows Class E airspace starting at the surface. You plan to operate at 300 feet AGL. What is required? Now, a lot of you are going to think that Class E airspace does not require authorization. And the reason that you're thinking that is because they already confused you by thinking that Class E airspace begins at 700 feet AGL, or Class E airspace can begin at 1,200 feet AGL. And you're already saying, well, it's 300 feet AGL that I'm going to be flying. I'm below 400 feet AGL as the FAA requires, so I'm good. I'm okay. But that's not what the question said. The tricky part of this question says that Class E airspace is beginning or starting at the surface. Anytime Class E airspace starts at the surface, you must get authorization from air traffic control. So let me read the answers to you. A, authorization from ATC prior to flight. B, nothing. You can fly freely in Class E airspace at 300 feet. Or C, A waiver only if you're flying at night. Now, of course, C is absolutely ridiculous. A is the correct answer, as you already know. You just needed confirmation. And B, when you're flying in Class E airspace, that is at the surface, as I mentioned, you must get authorization from air traffic control. The last question in this video, question number 20, has to do with temporary flight restriction, or TFR. Now, before I go into the question and give you the multiple choice answers, let me explain something to you very quickly. 2026 is the year that the FAA began enforcing these TFRs, or these violations of these TFRs. They're no longer giving you a little pat on the hand. They're telling you that you're going to have to pay $20,000, $25,000, $30,000 fines, and they're serious. So you do not want to be flying in a TFR. Make sure that you write this in your notes somewhere, because if you have this in your head, you will automatically know any question that has to do with a TFR. You will already know the answer. So here's the question. While flying your aerial survey, you notice a TFR over a stadium due to a major sporting event. Your flight path intersects this area. What must you do? Now, here are the multiple choice answers. A, fly under the TFR if you remain below 400 feet. B, avoid the TFR completely. Or C, request permission after takeoff. Now, you already know the answer. You just need confirmation of that answer. I gave you the answer already. The answer is B. Avoid a TFR completely. Do not go near it, because this is where you will get into the most amount of trouble. A TFR are legally binding airspace restrictions. Flying through a TFR without authorization, I'm repeating that, is a regulatory violation. Even if you are below 400 feet, drones cannot operate in a TFR unless authorized. Now, that was the last question that I had. I hope this video was helpful for you, because the FAA is now starting to implement these scenario-based questions. I am going to have 60 total questions on my website that you will be able to go through, and they are all scenario based. This is a new test and a new exam that I'm putting onto the website, so that way it will help you in order to be able to pass the exam, not only with the recent tests that were being taken and the information that you're already aware of from the previous study guides and everything, but also the newly based questions, the new question block that the FAA has in regard to how they're actually implementing these questions. I will give you these samples or examples on my website, and you will see a total number of 60 of those questions. So now I'm going to say good luck on the Part 107 exam. If you have any questions at all, shoot me a comment. I'll be happy to help you as much as I can. Until then, we'll see you on the next video, Part 4 of 7 in this series.